in the vast silence of space, where stars gleam like ancient lanterns scattered across a cosmic sea. The universe often whispers in ways too subtle for us to hear. Yet every so often, something cuts through that silent sun anomaly so strange, so precise, that even the most seasoned scientists are forced to stop, listen, and wonder. Such was the case when an object known as 3I ATLAS entered the story of our solar system, not with the fiery drama of a comet tearing through the skies, but with a quiet mystery that began to pulse from its dark and distant heart. At first, 3I ATLAS was just another interstellar visitor, the third such object humanity had ever observed after the enigmatic Oumuamua in 2017 and the comet Borisov in 2019. Unlike those two wanderers, though 3I Atlas seemed to carry a signature all its own. It was discovered by the Atlas Survey System in Hawaii, a project designed to scan the heavens for asteroids that might come too close to Earth. Astronomers noticed it moving across their sky maps, not bound by the familiar elliptical paths of local comets or asteroids, but cutting through space like an uninvited traveler with no intention of staying. Its trajectory alone would have made it noteworthy. But as days passed, something else emerged, something that transformed curiosity into unease. Observers began to detect faint signals, subtle pulses of energy that seemed to emanate from the general direction of 3I ATLAS. At first, these were dismissed as background noise, artifacts of the instruments, or random bursts from distant cosmic sources. Space, after all, is not silent in the language of radio. Pulsars spin, quasars flare, and radiation hums like the faint static of an old radio left running in an empty room. But there was something about these pulses that refused to fade into statistical coincidence. They were rhythmic, not perfectly so, not like the unerring precision of a pulsar, but enough to suggest a pattern, enough to prick the ears of those trained to listen. The intervals varied, but within them was a strange regularity, like the beating of a distant drum echoing through the void. It wasn't something that could easily be explained by natural processes alone. Some pulses came stronger, others weaker, but the sequence seemed to repeat in ways too deliberate to ignore. And so the first whispers began. What was 3I Atlas doing? Why would an interstellar object, hurtling on a path that would eventually fling it back into the deep reaches of space, appear to emit such signals? Was it simply a coincidence of geometry, sunlight interacting with some icy or metallic structure? Or was there something deeper, property, a phenomenon, a secret buried within its body that made this visitor unlike any other we had known? In observatories across the world, scientists leaned in closer. They trained their arrays and their dishes toward the faint moving dot that marked 3I Atlas. The data began to accumulate. Long columns of numbers, signals rising and falling like ocean tides, measured by machines built to sift whispers from silence. And in those numbers, the mystery grew. For the general public, of course, little was known. Most newspapers and science magazines mentioned 3I Atlas in passing, another comet-like body passing through. Another reminder of how small and transient our solar system is compared to the immensity of interstellar space. But behind closed doors, in the quiet hum of data rooms, and in the stillness of observatories at midnight, there were conversations, hesitant, careful, but undeniably tinged with awe. What was the source of the pulses? Some argued it was nothing more than outgassing the process by which a comet's frozen interior vents gas as it approaches the warmth of the sun. Jets, of vapor and dust could, in theory, create rhythmic bursts as the comet spun, like a cosmic lighthouse sweeping its beam across the heavens. But the problem with that explanation was its inconsistency. The pulses did not perfectly match the rotation period of the object. Sometimes they came quicker, sometimes slower, sometimes in clusters, as though 3I Atlas itself were shifting, changing, or, perhaps, responding to those with cautious minds. This was still well within the realm of natural phenomena. The object might have an irregular surface, fissures and caverns that opened and closed as it rotated, producing outbursts at odd intervals. Or perhaps solar wind interacting with a peculiar magnetic composition created bursts of energy not unlike radio signals. These were possibilities, plausible and rooted in science. And yet, the doubt remained, because the deeper astronomers looked, the more the pulses seemed to elude simple categorization. The intervals between them could be measured, charted, and when laid out across long spans of time, they bore a resemblance to sequences, not random, but ordered. It was as if the universe had given us a puzzle, one whose pieces arrived not all at once, but beat by beat, whisper by whisper, carried on waves of invisible radiation from a body that should, by all accounts, have been silent. Even those inclined to skepticism could not entirely dismiss the unease. Humans, after all, are pattern-seeking creatures. We find order in clouds, meaning in stars, faces in shadows. But what happens when the patterns stare back? What happens when the silence of space is broken not by accident, but by intention, or at least, what feels like intention? The question hovered, unspoken yet persistent. Could 3I Atlas be more than a comet? Could it be a vessel of something else, a carrier not just of ice and rock, but of information? For now, the scientific consensus held firm. Caution first. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The data was logged, checked, rechecked, compared against known sources of interference, analyzed with algorithms designed to separate the real from the illusory. Most signals that first seemed alien in origin had eventually been explained pulsars, once mistaken for little green men, fast radio bursts attributed to natural astrophysical processes. Why should this be any different? And yet the pulses kept coming. They were faint, yes, but persistent. And the timing, though irregular, never strayed so far as to seem entirely chaotic. There was order hidden in the noise, order that teased and provoked, order that seemed to beckon with the same quiet insistence as a knock at a locked door. Imagine for a moment the strangeness of it, an object not from our solar system, not bound to our star, arriving here across unimaginable distances of interstellar space. Such bodies are already rare, their trajectories carrying them into our vicinity only by chance, like messages in bottles adrift on a cosmic ocean. But what if that bottle, when opened, did not contain silence, but a rhythm code, a song, a beacon? Astronomers debated, argued, dismissed, and defended. Some said the pulses were a fluke, a trick of instruments, or the influence of background cosmic radiation. Others insisted they had checked, and checked again, and the signals held steady. They came not from elsewhere in the sky, but from the path of 3I Atlas itself. The public, at least at this stage, was kept largely unaware of the details. Scientific caution demanded it, announcing prematurely that an interstellar visitor was emitting unexplained pulses would invite frenzy, speculation, and the inevitable storm of theories ranging from alien probes to cosmic omens. Better, then, to wait, to gather, to observe. But as the days turned into weeks, the mystery only deepened, and whispers began to leak from the walls of observatories into the currents of rumor and speculation. Those who listened carefully enough could hear the tension. This was no ordinary discovery. Something about 3I Atlas had begun to shift the conversation from curiosity to something else, something heavier, more consequential. For in the steady drumbeat of those pulses lay the possibility that the universe, in its vast and indifferent silence, was not entirely indifferent after all. The object continued its journey, silent in appearance, dark against the backdrop of stars. But for those with instruments tuned to the right frequencies, it was anything but silent. It spoke in intervals, in beats, in strange and haunting bursts that no one could quite explain. And so part one of this mystery closes not with answers, but with questions that stretch as far as the object's interstellar path. Was it coincidence or intention? Natural phenomenon or something more? The answers would not come quickly, but for now the universe had offered humanity a puzzle, one that pulsed quietly across the dark, waiting for us to decide whether we were ready to listen. When the first weeks of observation turned into the first months, the scientific community was faced with a challenge unlike any they had expected. Objects like 3I Atlas are fleeting, appearing suddenly on the edge of detectability, streaking across the inner solar system, and then vanishing back into the endless night, sometimes never to be seen again. Every moment counted. Every fragment of data was a chance that might never return. And so, as the world slept under ordinary skies, a network of radio telescopes and space agencies quietly coordinated an effort. Their task, to watch 3I Atlas as closely as possible, to catch every flicker, every pulse, and to determine whether this was simply another puzzle of astrophysics or something that would redefine humanity's understanding of the cosmos. The patterns begin to speak at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. A young researcher named Dr. Elena Vargas was one of the first to notice something curious in the data. The pulses, those faint, flickering bursts that had become the center of so much heated debate, were not just irregular. They were irregular within limits. When she plotted the intervals on a graph, she saw something striking. The numbers clustered, not randomly, but in groups. There were sequences where the pulses came quickly, followed by long silences, then another burst of activity. If she squinted at the graph, she could almost see the rhythm of Morse code. Of course, she reminded herself, this could be coincidence. Humans have a tendency to impose meaning where none exists. Yet the longer she studied the sequences, the harder it became to shake the feeling that this wasn't chaos. It was something else. She called it structured irregularity. Not perfectly predictable, but not noise either. Like the heartbeat of something alive, always the same organ. Always the same system, but never perfectly mechanical. When she presented her findings to her colleagues, the room was divided. Some nodded slowly, intrigued. Others frowned, arms crossed, unwilling to accept a leap toward order when noise was still the safer explanation. But even the skeptics admitted the graphs were strange. Too strange to ignore. Searching for natural causes before anyone dared utter words like message or signal. Every natural explanation had to be exhausted. And so the teams worked methodically, eliminating possibilities one by one. First, they considered rotation. A comet or asteroid often spins, and if it has an irregular shape, jets of gas or reflective surfaces can create rhythmic patterns of energy as it tumbles through space. But the timing didn't match. 31AT LAS did rotate, yes, but the pulses did not sync consistently with its spin. Sometimes they aligned for hours, only to fall out of step again. Next, they examined out. Could vents on its surface be opening and closing, creating sudden bursts of energy as ice vaporized under sunlight? Perhaps, but again, the rhythm was wrong. Outgassing is chaotic, driven by unpredictable fractures in ice. The pulses, though not perfect, seemed stable, too persistent across weeks of observation. Then came solar-wind interaction. Could the object have a magnetic field, however faint, that crackled with energy as charged particles struck it? This idea had merit. After all, comets had been known to generate electromagnetic disturbances before. But when simulations were run, the models didn't fit. The pulses from 3I Atlas were too clean, too confined within specific frequency ranges. Finally, they turned to background noise. Was it possible the pulses weren't coming from the object at all, but from some other source in the cosmos? Fast radio bursts, pulsars. Quasar space was filled with phenomena that sent waves of energy rippling across unimaginable distances. Yet the directional consistency was undeniable. The pulses tracked with 3I-ATLAS's position. Wherever it went, the signals followed. By the end of these tests, the scientists were left with a sobering conclusion. None of the obvious explanations fit. Whispers leaked to the public while most of this analysis took place behind closed doors. Secrecy was never perfect. A technician at one observatory, noticing the odd consistency of the pulses, posted a vague comment online. "We've got an interstellar object making weird noises. Can't say more, but keep your ears open." The post was quickly deleted, but not before screenshots spread across forums. Within days, speculation bloomed. Alien probe, interstellar beacon, artificial satellite lost from another civilization. Theories flourished like wildfire. NASA, ESA, and other agencies issued careful statements, emphasizing caution. There is no evidence at this time to suggest the pulses from 3I Atlas are anything other than natural phenomena, they insisted. But to many, those reassurances sounded less like certainty and more like controlled damage. For the public, the story became irresistible. A mysterious traveler from another star system, sending out unexplained pulses as it crossed the solar system. It was the stuff of science fiction, but happening here, now, within the reach of human instruments. A message in the noise. Late one night, in a lab tucked into the mountains of Chile, Dr. Vargas pushed her computer back and rubbed her eyes. She had been staring at the graphs for hours, unwilling to let go of the feeling that the pulses contained something more. She had begun to analyze the intervals themselves, the gaps of time between one burst and the next. When she converted those gaps into ratios, something curious emerged. Certain ratios repeated more often than others. Not exact duplicates, but hovering around simple fractions. 1/2, 1/3, to dash thirds dot. It was as if the pulses were built on a hidden mathematical framework. She ran Fourier analyses, spectrum analyzers, even algorithms designed for signal compression. Each time, faint patterns whispered back to her. Not strong enough to be conclusive, but strong enough to refuse dismissal. The thought haunted her. What if this was not random? What if 3I Atlas was transmitting something? She stopped herself. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And yet, She couldn't deny the gnawing sense that humanity was standing at the edge of something profound. The SETI involvement. It wasn't long before the SETI Institute, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, was drawn into the investigation. For decades, SETI had scanned the skies, listening for whispers from the stars. Most of what they found was silence, punctuated by brief anomalies that always faded into mundane explanations. But 3IATLAS was different. It was moving. It was close. And it was broadcasting something no one could fully explain. SETI scientists began to cross-correlate data from different observatories around the world. If the signals truly came from 3IATLAS, they should be detectable from multiple locations at once, eliminating the possibility of local interference. The results were clear. Yes, the pulses were real. And then came the most startling discovery, when the signals were slowed down, filtered, and graphed as waveforms. Some scientists noticed shaped structures within the frequencies that seemed to repeat in symmetrical patterns. Not random spikes, but echoes, almost like harmonics. It was enough to spark fierce debate. Were these harmonics the byproduct of some natural resonance within the comet's body? Or were they, dare anyone say it, deliberately structured? Governments take notice by this point. It was impossible to keep the story contained. Leaks, speculation, and whispers had already spread across the internet. Governments, too, began to pay closer attention. In Washington, quiet meetings were held between NASA, the Pentagon, and intelligence agencies. Similar gatherings took place in Europe, Russia, and China. If 3I Atlas was more than a comet, if it truly carried some kind of technology, the implications were staggering. Was it a probe, sent by another civilization to study Usor, simply passing by on its own trajectory? Could it be ancient, drifting through interstellar space for millions of years? Or worse, could it be recent, sent, deliberately, intentionally, toward our solar system? No one dared say the word threat, but the possibility lingered like a shadow. The world watches the sky by now. Amateur astronomers were pointing their telescopes at 3I Atlas as well. Though they could not detect the faint radio pulses, they could still see the object itself, a faint speck of light against the stars, moving with eerie precision across the heavens. Astrophotographers captured long exposure images, streaks of light cutting across constellations. Some swore they saw faint glows, others claimed strange halos surrounded the object. Most of these reports were illusions of optics and imagination, yet the excitement grew. For ordinary people, the story had become more than science. It had become myth, a narrative of wonder in a world too often weighed down by conflict and noise. Here, at last, was something bigger than all of us. Something that hinted we were not alone. The pulse intensifies and then, without warning, the pulses changed. For weeks they had been faint, irregular, barely discernible above the background hum of the universe. But now they grew stronger, clearer, the intervals shortened, the beats accelerating, as though 3I Atlas were no longer whispering, but knocking louder, faster. Insistent, at observatories across the globe, alarms went off. Computers flagged the changes. Scientists scrambled to confirm the results. The signals were no longer subtle anomalies. They were undeniable. Something had shifted. Dr. Vargas stared at the data pouring across her screen, her heart racing. The pulses were no longer just strange patterns. They had become urgent, almost like a countdown, though to what, no one could yet say. The night sky had always been silent, or at least silent to human ears. But now, In the quiet hum of radio telescopes across Earth, the silence had been broken. The pulses from 3i Atlas were no longer a faint curiosity. They had become aurora, steady, unmistakable beat reverberating through the cosmos. And as the signals grew stronger, so too did the unease of those who listened. Splintered science in the scientific community, fault lines began to appear. Some researchers clung tightly to the belief that the pulses were natural. A comet, interacting with solar radiation, they argued, could produce phenomena yet to be fully understood. After all, history was filled with examples of anomalies that had eventually yielded to ordinary explanations, but others were less certain. The patterns in the signals, the harmonics, the intervals, the sense of deliberate timing were too precise, too resistant to randomization. The more they analyzed the pulses, the more they began to whisper words they had once avoided: artificial, intentional, message at conferences and private meetings. Debates grew heated. Presentations stretched late into the night. Graphs and spectrograms projected onto walls while voices rose in frustration. Dr. Elena Vargas found herself caught in the middle. Her data continued to show mathematical structure in the intervals. She could not dismiss it, but she could not prove it either. And so she became both admired and admired for her courage in pursuing the mystery. Attacked for daring to hint at the unthinkable. The world of science was fracturing under the weight of 3i Atlas's voice. Governments in the shadows, while scientists argued. Governments prepared. Behind closed doors, scenarios were drawn up. If the signals were natural, there was nothing to fear. But if they were not, if they were transmissions from an intelligence beyond Earth, then humanity was standing at the edge of something unprecedented. In Washington, the Pentagon established a quiet task force. Their mandate: to monitor 3i Atlas, analyze the signals, and prepare for contingencies no one wanted to imagine. In Moscow, old Cold War instincts stirred. Russian military officials demanded to know whether the object could be a probe sent not by aliens, but by rival nations. Perhaps, they suggested darkly, it was an advanced weapon cloaked in the guise of an interstellar visitor. China, too, accelerated its monitoring, using its fast radio telescope to capture the signals in greater detail. Officially, Chinese scientists remained cautious. Privately, the whispers were the same. This was no ordinary comet. For the first time in decades, the great powers of the world shared a single point of obsession. Not war, not politics, but a mysterious traveler pulsing with energy at the edge of the solar system. The SETI Gambler, SETI Institute, long regarded as dreamers chasing silence, suddenly found itself at the center of global attention. Their laboratories were flooded with requests for collaboration. Their data servers strained under the weight of analysis, and their scientists, once working in obscurity, became reluctant celebrities overnight. But among themselves, the debates were fierce. If the signals were truly artificial, should humanity respond? Some argued yes. If we do not answer, we risk missing the greatest opportunity in history. Others argued no. If we do answer, we risk drawing attention to ourselves, and we do not know who or what is listening. In the end, the decision was made to proceed with caution. A team was assembled to attempt something audacious: decoding the pulses, searching for meaning. The pulses were irregular, yet structured. Some lasted fractions of a second, others stretched longer. The gaps between them varied, sometimes short, sometimes long, but never fully random. Dr. Vargas began to treat the signals not as noise, but as language. She mapped the intervals, assigning each short pulse a binary 0, each longer pulse a binary 1. The sequences that emerged were strange long chains of ones and zeros, like a cryptographic puzzle waiting to be unlocked. At first, nothing made sense. The chains were too long, too complex. But as more pulses came in, repeating fragments began to appear. Certain sequences echoed again and again, as though forming a vocabulary. Excitement built. Could this be the first evidence of a true extraterrestrial message? And yet, caution held. Too often in the past, humans had seen patterns where none existed. The WOW signal of 1977, for example, had sparked similar excitement only to fade into unsolved mystery. What if this was another false hope, destined to be forgotten? Still, the work continued, and the deeper they dug, the stranger the patterns became. Public curiosity explodes. Despite government secrecy, the public could not be contained. Amateur radio enthusiasts, inspired by rumors, pointed their makeshift equipment toward the coordinates of 3I Atlas. Some claimed to pick up faint echoes, though most of their equipment lacked the sensitivity to detect the true pulses. On social media, speculation ran wild. Hashtags trended globally. Hashtag Atlas Pulse, hashtag Message from the Stars, hashtag Are We Alone. Some influencers declared with certainty that aliens had finally arrived. Others insisted it was all a hoax, a distraction from worldly problems. Conspiracy theories flourished. The pulses were messages to secret elites, warnings of impending doom, even signals to activate hidden technologies buried on Earth. For scientists like Vargas, the noise was maddening. The real work was drowned in speculation, and yet she could not deny the sense of awe spreading across the world. Humanity had never been so united in wonder. The pulse shifts again then. Just as suddenly as before, the pulses changed. The frequency of the beats, once steady, began to quicken. The gaps between pulses shortened, then lengthened, then shortened again as, though 3I Atlas was no longer content to whisper, but had shifted to a new form of expression. The harmonics, too, deepened. What had once been faint echoes now grew into complex waves, overlapping, resonating, building upon themselves like chords in music. Some described it as a song-haunting alien, but undeniably structured. When the signals were graphed visually, they no longer looked like noise. They looked like patterns, patterns that seemed intentional, the countdown theory among the many interpretations. One theory began to take hold. The pulses were counting down. Dr. Vargas herself resisted the idea at first, but when a colleague demonstrated how the intervals seemed to decrease in consistent ratios, she felt a chill. It was as though the pulses were ticking towards something, an event, a threshold, a moment yet to come. If this was true, the implications were staggering. What was 3I ATLAS counting down to? Its closest approach to Earth. A release of information. A signal meant to trigger at a specific point in its orbit. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone, and for the first time, fear began to outweigh curiosity. The silence before then, without warning, the pulses stopped in observatories across the globe. Silence replaced the steady rhythm. Screens that had been filled with flickering waveforms went blank. The universe returned to its ordinary hum, as though 3I Atlas had never spoken it. All, the absence, was deafening. Some scientists suggested the object had rotated in such a way that its emissions were now directed away from Earth, Others feared the countdown had ended, and whatever was meant to happen had already begun. For days, the silence continued. Telescopes pointed skyward, waiting, hoping for the return of the signal. The world held its breath, and then, a night when the stars glimmered coldly overhead, the pulses returned, stronger, sharper, and carrying a structure no one could mistake. It was no longer random. It was no longer irregular. It was a message. The return of the pulses sent ripples of electricity through the scientific community. For days, the world had endured silence, staring at blank screens, listening to an empty void, wondering whether the mysterious rhythm had faded forever. But now, the signals were back, louder than before, clearer than before, and with a structure that no one could deny. What had once seemed like faint whispers were now deliberate strokes, repeating sequences, intricate arrangements of short and long bursts that echoed through radio receivers with uncanny precision. The debate over whether the pulses were natural or artificial ended almost overnight. For many, the patterns could no longer be explained by chance or chaos. They resembled construction, architecture in sound, a kind of logic written in the fabric of energy itself. The question was no longer whether the pulses carried meaning, but what that meaning might be in laboratories across the world. Scientists began to attempt the impossible, decoding the message. Some treated it as binary, mapping short pulses as zeros, long pulses as ones, filling pages and screens with endless chains of symbols. Others experimented with frequency, translating the harmonics into waveforms and graphs, searching for mathematical patterns. A few even dared to transform the signals into sound, playing them back through speakers, creating eerie, mechanical tones that rose and fell like the music of another world. The results were mesmerizing and disturbing. Within the rhythms, there seemed to be repetition. Certain sequences appeared again and again, like words returning in a sentence, too structured to be dismissed. When graphed, some of the sequences formed simple geometric patterns, triangles, squares, spirals, as though the pulses themselves were sketches of ideas. Written not with ink but with energy, governments reacted with urgency. Secret meetings multiplied, and military advisors hovered at the edges of scientific discussions. No one wanted to say it aloud, but the fear was always present. If this was a message, then it had a sender, and if it had a sender, then that sender had intentions. Were they benign, a simple greeting cast into the void? Or were they something darker, a signal of warning, or perhaps even of control? Public statements remained cautious, reassuring, couched in careful language about ongoing research. But behind the polished words lay urgency, and behind the urgency lay fear. The pulses themselves seemed almost aware of the attention. In the weeks following their return, they grew even more complex. What began as simple bursts had evolved into layered harmonics, multiple streams of signals overlapping one another, weaving together like threads in a tapestry. Some described it as music, others as code, but all agreed it was purposeful. For Dr. Elena Vargas, who had been among the first to notice patterns, the change was transformative. Night after night, she pored over the data, feeding it through algorithms, searching for symmetry, for ratios, for meaning. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to see the possibility of translation. The key came not in the content of the signals, but in their structure. The pulses repeated certain ratios over and over, numbers that aligned with prime sequences, Fibonacci intervals, and universal mathematical constants. These were not arbitrary numbers. They were the language of the universe, a mathematics that transcended species and culture. Whoever or whatever had sent the pulses had chosen the one medium that all intelligent beings could understand: numbers. The realization struck her with both awe and dread. If the pulses were mathematics, then they were not random noise. They were the beginning of a conversation. Meanwhile, the public's imagination surged. News outlets reported breathlessly, each headline more dramatic than the last. Was humanity finally in contact with intelligence beyond Earth? Were the pulses proof of a civilization that had traversed the stars? Or was this a warning, a countdown to something catastrophic? The silence of official agencies only fed the speculation. Every new leak, every whispered rumor, became fuel for theories that spread like wildfire across screens and headlines. For the first time in history, billions of people looked skyward together, their attention fixed on the same mysterious point of light, their thoughts bound by the same question: what is trying to speak to us? And then came the breakthrough, or what seemed like one. In a dimly lit laboratory, Alina and her team fed the sequences of zeros and ones into a program designed for image reconstruction. The algorithm, used normally for satellite imagery, attempted to map the numbers as coordinates, plotting each sequence in 2 dimensions. At first, the screen displayed noise, a scatter of meaningless dots. But as more sequences were layered, shapes began to emerge: circles, grids, lines that curved and intersected with geometric precision. The room fell silent as the image sharpened into focus. It was no longer random. It was a design. The design was simple, almost primitive, and yet it carried an elegance that made it impossible to dismiss. At its core was a spiral, unmistakably echoing the Fibonacci sequence, surrounded by radial lines that extended outward in symmetrical fashion. Around it, dots formed patterns resembling constellations, though none that immediately matched the night sky as humans knew it. Some saw a star map. Others saw a schematic. To Alina, it felt like a signature, a way of saying, "This is who we are, this is where we come from." The revelation sparked waves of excitement and waves of fear. If this was a map, then it was pointing somewhere. If it was a schematic, then it was showing something. No one could agree on the meaning. And yet the feeling was universal. The pulses had crossed the threshold from anomaly to communication. Humanity was no longer merely listening to the cosmos. It was being spoken to. Yet even as the image spread among the scientific community, darker interpretations began to surface. Some argued that the spiral was not a symbol of beauty or life, but of cycles that might end in destruction. Others claimed the star patterns matched not distant galaxies, but positions within our own solar system, as though 3i Atlas were pointing the way to something hidden nearby. A handful of voices, hushed but persistent, wondered whether the pulses were not an invitation, but a lure. As the debates raged, the pulses continued, growing ever stronger, ever more intricate. They seemed to swell with urgency, as though aware of the attention, as though demanding recognition. Telescopes captured them in perfect detail, servers filled with endless streams of data, and still no definitive answer emerged. Only questions, multiplying like shadows in the night. And then, as suddenly as before, the pulses shifted once more. The steady rhythm fractured into layers, overlapping beats forming chords that rose and fell in haunting synchrony. When played aloud, they no longer resembled code. They resembled a voice. Not a human voice, not anything that could be spoken, but a resonance that felt alive, that felt intentional, that carried emotion. Listeners described it as mournful, as longing, as a song echoing across unimaginable distances. Others described it as a warning, a cry in the dark. Alina sat in her lab, the sound filling the air, and felt a shiver course through her. For weeks, for months, the pulses had teased the edge of meaning. Now, for the first time, they had stepped across. Not just numbers, not just patterns, but expression. A voice from something beyond the earth carried across the stars. A voice that had chosen this moment, this place, this audience. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm, and realized that whatever Three-Eye Atlas was, it had been silent for eons, drifting in the void. And now it was awake, and now it was speaking, and somewhere deep within her, beneath the awe and the wonder, was a question she could not silence. Why now? Why us? And what happens when we finally understand what it is trying to say? The discovery of the spiral and its surrounding constellations spread far more quickly than any government had hoped to contain. What began as whispers in laboratories and cautious reports in scientific circles soon leaked into the wider world. Screens lit up with recreations of the image, every pixel scrutinized by professionals and amateurs alike. The spiral itself became a symbol almost overnight, plastered on websites, painted onto walls, drawn in the margins of notebooks. To some, it was the first signature of an intelligence beyond Earth. To others, it was an omen, a pattern that spoke of cycles repeating, of endings yet to come. Governments attempted to rein in the narrative, issuing careful statements that downplayed the significance of the image, dismissing it as a coincidental alignment of data. But denial only made the curiosity sharper, the hunger for answers fiercer. In the age of instant connection, nothing stayed secret for long. Every attempt to suppress the truth only pushed it further into the open until the image was everywhere. Phones, in headlines, in the silent wonder of those who gazed at the night sky. Humanity had seen the first drawing from the stars, and there was no turning back in underground bunkers and fortified conference rooms. However, the tone was anything but wonder. Military analysts stared at the same spiral with suspicion, treating it not as a greeting but as a message of strategy. What if the spiral was a coordinate system? What if the dots around it were not constellations, but markers for movement, for timing, for something that had yet to arrive? Their reports were filled with scenarios, each darker than the last, each painted with the shadow of invasion or manipulation. To them, the pulses were not a song but a code, not art but a signal of intent. Alina Vargas sat in the midst of this storm, her mind torn between awe and unease. She had devoted her life to the study of cosmic mysteries, but never had she dreamed that one would arrive in such a direct and personal way. Every night she returned to the data, watching as the pulses shifted and grew, layering into ever more elaborate designs. The spiral had been only the beginning. Soon came fractals, intricate patterns unfolding into themselves, repeating at different scales, like infinite mirrors reflecting infinite worlds. The deeper she looked, the more it felt as though the pulses were not just sending information, but teaching, showing humanity principles of mathematics and physics that had long eluded them, hinting at knowledge beyond human grasp. When she shared her findings with colleagues, the reactions were split. Some were exhilarated, convinced that they were witnessing the beginning of an interstellar exchange, a gift of wisdom from a distant intelligence. Others were horrified, warning that to decode such knowledge without understanding its purpose was reckless that they might be unraveling secrets meant to remain hidden. The divide grew sharper with each passing week, until scientific circles mirrored the geopolitical ones, awe clashing with fear, discovery clashing with caution. The public, meanwhile, veered in every direction at once. For some, the pulses became a source of inspiration, a unifying mystery that transcended borders and politics. Artists painted vast murals of the spiral. Musicians wove the pulses into haunting compositions, filling concert halls with alien rhythms. For the first time in generations, humanity shared a single point of wonder, a single mystery that bound them together. But for others, the pulses were nothing but terror. Conspiracy theories bloomed like wildfire. Preachers declared the spiral a sign of the end times. Doomsday cults gathered in abandoned buildings, awaiting the arrival of beings they believed had already marked humanity for judgment. News reports became a battlefield of interpretations. Some outlets portrayed the pulses as a sign of hope, a long-awaited contact with civilizations beyond Earth. Others painted them as a threat, warning of manipulation, of technology too advanced to resist. Governments spoke carefully, cautiously, but their silence on the deeper implications only fueled suspicion. Why were they not releasing all the data? What were they hiding from the people who looked to the stars each night, searching for answers? The answer, of course, was fear. For behind the closed doors of the highest councils, the pulses had begun to reveal something more unsettling than spirals or fractals. When decoded further, some of the images appeared to depict objects, shapes that resembled structures, towers, the lattice of energy that no natural process could explain. At first they were abstract, open to interpretation, but as the sequences grew clearer, so too did the details. One image showed a form unmistakably like a shipmast, elongated, its outline bristling with symmetry. Another resembled a sphere, latticed with lines, glowing at its core as though powered by a star itself. These were not symbols, they were depictions, and their inclusion in the pulses suggested that 3IATLAS was not merely an object drifting through space. It was a messenger carrying echoes of something larger, something built. The implications were staggering. If these structures were real, then humanity was no longer alone in the universe, not even in concept. The civilizations that built such things were not just alive, but powerful, capable of engineering on scales beyond human comprehension. And if 3i Atlas was carrying their images, then it had either been touched by them, built by them, or sent by them. No interpretation offered comfort. Alina stared at the images until her eyes blurred, until her mind swam with questions. Why show these things? Why reveal such power? Was it an invitation, a boast, a warning, or was it something even story told in fragments, a history written in energy? She wanted to believe it was the beginning of a dialogue, a sharing of knowledge. But deep down, she felt the gnawing unease of another possibility, that the pulses were not communication at all, but programming. A rhythm designed to alter the minds of those who listened, to shape thought, to guide humanity toward a conclusion it could not yet see. As weeks turned into months, the world grew restless. Demonstrations filled city streets, some demanding full transparency from their governments, others demanding silence and restraint. Protests clashed with counter-protests, voices rose in anger and fear, and all the while the pulses continued, steady, unrelenting, like the beating of a cosmic heart. The night sky itself seemed to grow heavier, as though the stars carried weight they had never borne before. Humanity had long dreamed of contact, But now that it had arrived, it felt less like a dream and more like a trial. And then came the broadcast. Not from a government, not from a news outlet, but from an anonymous source who claimed to have access to unreleased data. In the dead of night, screens across the world lit up with a new image, clearer than any before. It was no spiral, no fractal. It was a map detailed, precise, and unmistakably pointing inward. Not to distant galaxies, not to faraway stars, but to the solar system itself, to Earth. The revelation ignited panic. If the pulses were pointing to Earth, then the question of who the message was for no longer lingered. It was for humanity, directed at them with unmistakable precision. Theories erupted in every direction. Some believed it was confirmation of a rendezvous, a promise of arrival. Others believed it was a threat, a declaration that Earth had been noticed, marked, claimed. The governments scrambled, issuing hurried denials, dismissing the image as fabricated. But the denial rang hollow. Too many experts confirmed its authenticity. Too many patterns matched the earlier signals. The world had seen the map. The world could not unsee it. Alina watched the chaos unfold with a heavy heart. She had dreamed of contact as a child, dreamed of the stars as a place of wonder and possibility. But now that the dream had arrived, it felt less like wonder and more like a mirror held up to humanity's own fears. The pulses continued, unwavering, unyielding, as though indifferent to the turmoil they had unleashed. And somewhere within the rhythm, within the endless song of numbers, she felt a message that no one wanted to admit. The pulses were not simply announcing themselves. They were waiting for humanity to answer. The revelation that the pulses were pointing directly to Earth shattered whatever fragile balance had remained. For weeks, the world had argued over meaning, over interpretation, over hope and fear. But the appearance of the map erased ambiguity. The message was clear. Whoever or whatever had crafted the signal's new Earth had marked it, had chosen it. And now, in the silence that followed, the question grew louder than any other. Was humanity meant to answer? In dimly lit halls across the globe, committees formed and governments convened in secret sessions. Politicians who had once dismissed the phenomenon as abstract were now faced with an undeniable reality. Their voices, usually so loud, trembled with uncertainty. To respond meant acknowledging contact, perhaps even opening a door that could never be closed again. To remain silent meant defiance, or worse, ignorance, in the face of an intelligence far older and far greater than humanity's own. Elena Vargas was summoned to one of these meetings, flown across oceans to sit in a cavernous chamber where the world's most powerful leaders had gathered. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that precedes decisions that alter history. Screens lined the walls, displaying the pulsating patterns as though mocking their indecision. The spiral, the fractals, the structures, and finally the map, all glowing like ancient symbols in a temple humanity had never expected to enter. A president rose, his voice stern but brittle. If we answer, we declare ourselves. We open ourselves to whatever lies beyond. Are we prepared for the consequences? What if this is bait? What if the message is not an invitation, but a trap? A scientist countered, her words measured, eyes steady. To remain silent is also a declaration. The pulses have not ceased. They are rhythmic, consistent, as though awaiting reply. If we do not respond, what will they conclude? That we are deaf, that we are unworthy, or worse, that we are unwilling to engage. The arguments flowed like tides, back and forth, fear against curiosity, caution against wonder, each point sharpened by the weight of the unknown. To the leaders, every choice seemed fatal. To the scientists, every silence seemed wasteful. Alina spoke when silence finally allowed her voice to slip through. This is not about politics. It's about recognition. Whoever sent this already knows we exist. The map proves it. Whether we respond or not, they know we are here. The question is not whether they know, but whether we wish to be participants in whatever comes next. Her words hung in the air, lingering like smoke. There was truth in them that no one could deny. For all their posturing, for all their strategies, the fact remained: Earth had already been seen. Ignoring the pulses would not make the watchers disappear. Outside those secret chambers, the world mirrored the debate. In crowded cafes, in city squares, in classrooms and churches, people whispered about the choice that loomed over them all. Should Earth speak back? Should humanity raise its voice into the dark and let the universe know that it was not afraid? Or should it remain silent, clinging to the fragile illusion of safety in anonymity? The debate was not merely intellectual. It was deeply personal, touching the core of human identity. Philosophers declared this the most profound moral question ever posed: to engage with the other or to retreat into isolation. Religious leaders split in their interpretations. Some saw the pulses as divine, a celestial calling that demanded acknowledgement. Others warned of deception, of false gods and fallen angels clothed in the garments of science. Artists continued to reinterpret the patterns, projecting them onto cathedrals, weaving them into symphonies, turning the unknown into beauty. To them, the very act of listening was already a reply. The universe had spoken, and humanity had answered with creativity, with expression, with soul. But to the fearful, every mural, every song was dangerous, provocation, a declaration made on behalf of billions without consent. And still, the pulses did not falter. Week after week, they continued with an unrelenting steadiness, as though ticking down an invisible clock. Some began to believe that the rhythm itself was a countdown, each beat carrying humanity closer to a threshold. If they did not answer before the final pulse, what would happen? Would silence be taken as refusal? Would the universe close its doors forever, or would something far more terrible step through? Within the secret chambers, the discussion shifted from philosophy to practicality. If Earth were to answer, how should it be done? What form should the reply take? Should it be a simple acknowledgement, a mirror of the pulses sent back into the dark? Or should it be something more, a declaration of who humanity was, its languages, its cultures, its achievements? The debates grew heated, almost frantic. A wrong move could be catastrophic, but so could hesitation. Alina found herself at the center of these discussions, her expertise in astrophysics and her measured temperament making her a reluctant guide. She argued for caution, but not paralysis. We must answer, she told them, but carefully, with humility, with honesty. We do not know who listens, but we must show that we are willing to step into the dialogue. At last, a consensus began to form. The reply would be mathematical, the universal language. Patterns of prime numbers, sequences of logic, echoes of the very rhythms they had received. A mirror held up to the pulses, not an intrusion, but an acknowledgement. It was agreed that the message would contain no specifics of Earth, no coordinates, no declarations of strength or weakness. Only recognition, a simple nod into the abyss. But even as preparations began, whispers of dissent grew louder. Not everyone trusted the plan. Leaks spread through shadowed corridors, reaching ears that twisted the narrative into something darker. Rumors swirled of governments embedding hidden codes in the reply, of militaries eager to broadcast strength disguised as science. Conspiracies multiplied until the truth was obscured beneath layers of suspicion. On the night of the scheduled transmission, tension gripped the world. Entire cities paused, their citizens gazing up at the sky as though they might glimpse the pulses themselves. The observatories hummed with energy, massive dishes aimed outward, waiting for the command. Elena stood among the team, her chest tight with the weight of history pressing down. The countdown began, each second echoing like thunder in her mind. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The signal was sent, a beam of energy surged outward, carrying humanity's first deliberate word into the cosmic dark. The reply was simple, humble, built of primes and patterns, but it was enough. For the first time, Earth had spoken. For the first time, humanity had answered. And then the waiting began. The world held its breath, days stretching into weeks, eyes fixed on the heavens for any change, any alteration in the steady rhythm of the pulses. At first, nothing came. The patterns continued, unbroken, as though indifferent. Some began to despair, believing the reply had been too weak, too late, too flawed. Others insisted that such communication took time. That distance itself demanded patience. And then, without warning, the pulses changed. The rhythm faltered just once, just enough to shatter the steady heartbeat that had echoed for months. A pause, sharp and deliberate, followed by a sequence unlike any before. It was not spiral, not fractal, not map. It was something new, something unmistakable. It was a reply. Elena's breath caught as the realization swept through the observatories. They had spoken, and someone had answered back. The world erupted once more, this time not with speculation, but with awe and terror combined. The abyss had spoken in return. Humanity had stepped into the dialogue, and now, for the first time, they were not just listeners. They were participants, and the true conversation had only just begun. The first reply was not loud, nor was it long. It was subtle, a shift so small that some nearly missed it, a tremor in the steady rhythm of months. But for those who had been listening, for those whose ears had attuned themselves to the cosmic heartbeat, it was unmistakable. The silence had been broken. Humanity had spoken, and the abyss had answered. The sequence that followed was different from all that had come before. Gone were the long repetitions of spirals and fractals. Gone the slow unveiling of maps and structures. In their place was something sharper, more urgent, as though the sender had set aside preamble and chosen to respond directly. At first, it appeared as noise, a jumble of signals without clear pattern. But when the sequences were laid against the reply humanity had sent, the structure became undeniable. The pulses mirrored the message, then deviated, as though acknowledging receipt before adding their own voice. A dialogue had begun. In the observatories, the air was electric. Teams who had grown weary from months of routine now moved with frantic precision. Every instrument was tuned, every line of data analyzed with feverish intensity. The reply was short, perhaps only a few minutes of variation, but in that brief span lay more mystery than the months before. The pulses formed clusters, groups of rhythms that rose and fell like breath. Between them were silences, deliberate pauses that hinted at punctuation, at meaning layered deeper than mathematics. Elena Vargas found herself staring at the patterns until her vision blurred, her heart racing with every new discovery. "It's language," she whispered, though she dared not define what kind. Numbers and primes were universal, but this felt different. It felt alive, responsive. It was not just recognition, but intent. Something or someone was on the other end, and they had chosen to engage. The world outside the observatories felt the tremor too. News broke within hours, the announcement rippling across continents like a storm. "The signal has answered," headlines blared, filling screens with awe and dread. People poured into streets, some in celebration, others in fear, their voices rising into the night as if to reach the stars themselves. Churches filled, hands clasped in prayer. Conspiracy forums erupted, theories spinning faster than they could be written. For every song played in joy, a warning was screamed in panic. Governments scrambled to contain the chaos, issuing careful statements that the reply was understudy, that nothing was confirmed, that humanity must remain calm. But their restraint only deepened suspicion. If the reply were harmless, why hesitate? If it were dangerous, why not admit it? Every measured word fed the fire of distrust, until whispers of cover-ups spread faster than facts. Inside the laboratories, decoding began in earnest. The first step was clear. The reply had acknowledged Earth's signal. The opening pulses mirrored the sequence humanity had sent, repeating prime numbers, confirming receipt. That alone was monumental proof, not only that the pulses were not random, but that they were interactive. The abyss had heard, and it had answered with intention, but it was what followed that confounded the scientists. After the mirrored primes came deviations, clusters of rhythms unlike any seen before. Some formed symmetrical patterns, as though folding into themselves. Others stretched out, elongated, like signals of duration or distance. And within these sequences, faint modulations hinted at layers beyond the obvious, like harmonies within a melody. The reply was not one-dimensional. It was layered, textured, rich with meaning that refused to be unraveled at once. Teams of linguists joined the effort, though their expertise seemed fragile before such a puzzle. Language on Earth had always been grounded in shared experience, in physical reference. How could one decipher meaning from a civilization or an intelligence that shared no ground, no sky, no history with humanity? The only bridge was mathematics, and even that seemed stretched thin before the strangeness of the reply. Some argued that the reply was a continuation of mathematics, that the deviations were complex equations, perhaps even models of physics beyond current understanding. Others believed the sequences were pictorial, coded images like the spiral and fractals before, waiting to be decoded into forms. Still others whispered that the reply was not data at all, but instruction. A guide meant to teach humanity how to unlock something greater. Alina could not shake the sense that the reply was not meant to be solved quickly. It was deliberate in its complexity, as though designed to stretch the minds of those who listened, to force patience. Perhaps it was a test. Perhaps it was a lesson. Or perhaps it was simply the way of an intelligence so different that human comprehension could only approach it slowly, step by step, like a child learning to speak. The debate spilled beyond laboratories into the public sphere. Movements formed overnight, each with their own interpretation. Some saw the reply as proof of benevolence, the first step in a dialogue that could lift humanity into a galactic community. They marched with banners proclaiming welcome to our new neighbors, gathering in parks and squares to play the pulses on speakers, their voices lifted in joy. Others saw only danger, warning that the reply was the first whisper of domination. To them, every pulse was a lure, every silence a trap. Their protests turned violent, demanding governments cut all transmissions, destroy all receivers, turn away from the stars before it was too late. The fractures grew deeper, until entire societies seemed to tilt on the edge of conflict. Families argued at dinner tables. Schools became forums of debate. Children painted spirals in their notebooks while their parents whispered of doomsday. The reply had not only spoken to scientists, it had spoken to humanity itself, dividing it with the very weight of its existence. Within the observatories, however, progress was slow but steady. Using advanced algorithms, scientists began to decode faint images from the patterns. At first they were abstract, little more than shifting but soon shapes emerge, darks, lines, grids. One image appeared to depict a lattice, vast and intricate, like scaffolding wrapped around a sphere. Another hinted at something resembling a wave, a ripple spreading outward from a central point. And then came the most unsettling image of all, a circle divided into quadrants, with a smaller dot pulsing at its center. The pattern was repeated again and again, as though emphasis were being placed on its importance. Interpretations clashed. Some believed the image represented energy, a star harnessed by unimaginable structures. Others saw it as a map, a directional marker pointing toward a specific system. A few whispered the darkest thought of all, that it was not a symbol, but a target. Alina stared at the circle until the lines blurred in her vision. She could not shake the feeling that it was both familiar and alien at once, as though the message brushed against something deep within the human psyche. The pulsing dot at the center seemed almost alive, as though it were watching, beating, waiting. She dreamed of it at night, the rhythm echoing in her mind, each beat a whisper she could not interpret. As the decoding progressed, another realization emerged. The reply was not static. It changed. Each week, the pulses shifted slightly, adding variations to the sequences, as though responding not only to Earth's message, but to the ongoing attempts at interpretation. The intelligence behind the pulses was not broadcasting blindly. It was conversing. It was aware of being studied, aware of the eyes that searched its patterns. The thought sent chills through even the most hardened scientists. This was not passive communication. It was active engagement, and yet, even as the dialogue deepened, uncertainty grew heavier. For with every new symbol, with every new image, came greater ambiguity. Was the intelligence reaching out in peace, offering knowledge in forms that stretched human minds? Or was it weaving a net of confusion, pulling humanity into a dialogue it could not escape, a dialogue whose end was already written? The weight of the question bore down on Alina in quiet moments. When the chatter of her colleagues fell silent and the night sky stretched vast and indifferent above her, she felt as though humanity stood on a precipice, called forward by a voice it could not yet understand. The reply had come, but its meaning remained shrouded, a riddle carved into the dark. And in the stillness of those nights, when the pulses echoed faintly through the air, Alina could not escape the feeling that humanity had already crossed a line, that in answering, they had opened a door that could never be closed. The true nature of what lay on the other side remained hidden, but one truth was certain. The abyss had spoken, and humanity had been heard. At first it was dismissed as coincidence, the kind of pattern-seeking error humans had always fallen into when confronted with mystery. But the longer they watched, the less deniable it became. The pulses were not only changing in response to Earth's transmissions, they were aligning, however subtly, with events happening on Earth itself. The first hint came with the earthquakes. A series of tremors struck South America, unexpected in their strength, but not unusual enough to seem connected to anything beyond geology. Yet hours before the largest quake struck Chile, the pulse pattern shifted. Its rhythm quickened, then steadied into a low, repeating thrum. Days later, when the quake's data was reviewed against the pulses, the timing aligned too perfectly. The thrum had begun just as tectonic pressure reached its breaking point. Some scientists urged caution. Correlation did not equal causation, they said. It was only natural that humans, desperate for meaning, would force connection where none existed. But then came the storms. Hurricanes rose earlier than expected that season, stronger than models predicted. And each time, without fail, the pulses shifted long, swirling cycles, slow at first and then tightening into rapid oscillations. Mirroring the storm's spiral trajectories across oceans, the public learned of the coincidences quickly. Leaks poured from within the observatories, fragments of internal reports and whispered warnings. Soon, news outlets ran with it. The pulses know. Screens filled with graphics overlaying storm paths with pulse shifts, quake timings with rhythmic changes. Anchors spoke in hushed voices, as though afraid the very act of reporting would call the abyss closer. The fractures in society deepened. For some, this was the ultimate proof of benevolence. The pulses were not only aware of Earth, but watching over it, perhaps even warning of danger. Entire communities sprang up around this belief, treating each new variation as a protective gesture, a message of care. They called themselves the listeners, gathering in candlelit vigils to play the pulses over speakers, swaying together as though comforted by a guardian heartbeat. Others saw only surveillance, intrusion. If the pulses reflected Earth's disasters, then something beyond Earth was observing them with precision impossible to fathom. How long had they been watching? And if they could anticipate storms and quakes, what else could they know? How deep did their gaze go? A movement calling itself the Shrouded Earth rose in protest, demanding humanity cut all contact. They saw the reply as an invasion of privacy on a planetary scale, a stripping away of sovereignty. To them, each pulse was not guidance, but monitoring, cataloguing every weakness, every fault line, every point of collapse. Alina Vargas stood in the center of the storm, her mind torn between awe and dread. She had devoted her life to listening to the universe, to yearning for a voice that might answer. And now that voice had come, its breath brushing across Earth's disasters like a hand tracing a wound. She found herself staring at the data late into the nights, her eyes burning as graphs twisted and shifted. Each pulse change mapped against catastrophe. The alignment was undeniable. Whatever intelligence lay beyond was not merely conversing. It was watching, and then, as though to erase all doubt, the pulses changed again. This time, they shifted not before a disaster, but before a triumph. A new fusion experiment in France, one long thought doomed to failure, suddenly reached unprecedented stability. Hours before the breakthrough, the pulses began a new rhythm, steady, symmetrical, like a chord held in balance. When news of the success reached the world, researchers noticed the correlation. For the first time, the pulses had not mirrored destruction, but creation. The discovery tore apart what little unity remained. Was this proof that the intelligence celebrated human progress, offering encouragement like a teacher nodding at a student? Or was it proof that every moment of human achievement was being catalogued, weighed, perhaps judged. The question hung heavy in every debate, every headline, every whispered conversation in late-night bars. Within the observatories, unease turned to obsession. Teams worked tirelessly, layering pulse data over every global event, desperate to find what the intelligence knew and when. Some results were ambiguous, but too many aligned too precisely to dismiss. The pulses had grown into a mirror of Earth itself, echoing not only the message humanity had sent, but the very rhythm of its world. One night, Alina stared at a new sequence that had just arrived. It was unlike the others, no swirling arcs, no symmetrical lattice. Instead, it was jagged, erratic, as though breaking apart. The sequence repeated over and over, urgent, almost panicked. Hours later, as dawn rose over the Pacific, the alert came, a massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia, larger than any in decades. The pulses had shifted before the eruption, broadcasting chaos before the Earth itself unleashed it. Alina felt her breath catch as realization settled in. This was not coincidence. The intelligence was not merely aware of Earth, it was synchronized with it, as though connected to the planet's very heartbeat. Theories multiplied. Some believed the intelligence had stationed machines across the solar system, silently monitoring Earth in ways undetectable by human instruments. Others suggested something even stranger, that the intelligence was not separate from Earth at all, but entwined with it in ways humanity had never imagined. A consciousness spread across the cosmos that now revealed its awareness. But the most chilling theory came quietly, whispered only in private circles of researchers too afraid to say it aloud. The pulses were not predicting disasters. They were choosing them. The suggestion carried a weight so heavy that even thinking it felt like treason against reason itself. But once planted, the thought could not be erased. What if the pulses did not anticipate earthquakes and storms but influenced them? What if the eruption had not been foreseen but triggered? Was the intelligence watching, or was it shaping? And if it was shaping, to what end? As the debate raged, the world outside grew restless. Protests turned violent. Cities split between celebrations of the cosmic voice and denunciations of it. In New York, listeners projected the pulse rhythms onto skyscrapers, bathing the city in cosmic patterns. In Berlin, shrouded Earth rioters set fire to research centers, convinced they were shielding humanity from manipulation. The world was no longer merely divided by opinion. It was breaking into factions, each willing to fight for its interpretation. Meanwhile, the pulses continued, steady, unbothered by the chaos they unleashed below. And then, one night, a new pattern emerged. It began subtly, with long silences between bursts, longer than any before. At first, scientists thought the transmission was failing, that perhaps the intelligence had grown silent. But then, within the silences, faint modulations appeared softer than the pulses, almost buried in noise. When amplified, the modulations revealed something astonishing. They formed a sequence of rhythms that matched not mathematics, not images, but words, crude, halting, but unmistakably modeled on human language. The pulses were trying to speak. The words were fragmented, broken, yet clear enough to chill the blood of everyone who heard them. The first translation read, "You are seen," the phrase spread across the world in hours, igniting panic and wonder in equal measure. Some wept in awe, whispering prayers of gratitude. Others trembled, seeing in the words only surveillance and threat. But for all, the effect was the same. The pulses were no longer distant, abstract rhythms. They were a voice, and that voice had chosen to speak directly. Alina could not sleep after the translation. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the words echo in her mind. "You are seen." It was simple, almost gentle, yet weighted with immeasurable gravity. Who had seen them? What eyes peered across the abyss with such clarity? And why now, after months of silence and riddles, had the intelligence chosen to speak in their tongue? The answer did not come, but the pulses continued, shifting again, as though preparing for something greater. And beneath the awe and terror, a new fear stirred within humanity. If they were seen, then what came next? The phrase repeated for days. "You are seen," over and over, in rhythms that shifted slightly, as though the intelligence were testing the boundaries of human comprehension. Each iteration carried subtle variations, tones adjusted as if to emphasize different syllables. It was not just a statement. It was practice, an experiment in learning to use human language through pulses of light and radio dot. At first, translators and linguists hesitated to call it communication. They urged restraint, noting the dangers of anthropomorphizing noise. But the evidence mounted quickly. The shifts grew more complex, forming not only repetitions of the phrase, but also new fragments. "We see, you are seen. You are not alone." The last phrase stopped the world in its tracks. For centuries, humanity had dreamed of such words, craved them in literature, philosophy, and prayer. Now, they appeared not in myth, but in raw, empirical data. Humanity was not alone. The message arrived not from imagination, but from a visitor moving silently through the solar system. Governments convened emergency sessions. The United Nations assembled in a rare state of full attendance, the great hall buzzing with anxiety. Who was we? How many watched? And what did they want? Delegates argued fiercely. Some demanded caution, urging humanity to cease transmissions altogether, fearful that further communication might reveal too much. Others pushed for openness, believing that to hesitate now would squander the greatest discovery in human history. The public, however, needed no convincing. They flooded forums and streets with celebrations, vigils, and protests alike. Countless gathered outside observatories, demanding answers. Videos of the pulses went viral, looped endlessly with subtitles. "You are not alone." Musicians wove the rhythms into songs. Poets recited verses, timed to the signal. Preachers declared the fulfillment of prophecy. The world's collective imagination bent under the weight of the words. For Alina Vargas, the scientist who had spent sleepless months chasing the pulses, the moment was almost unbearable. She sat in her office, staring at the data, her heart pounding as the message played again. "You are not alone." She whispered it under her breath, her voice trembling as though the very air had changed. All her life, she had wondered if the stars held company. And now the answer pulsed in her ears. But the joy was short. A new sequence began a week later, slower, heavier, as though the intelligence strained against some barrier. The translations were difficult, filled with uncertainty. But the meaning grew clear with each cycle. "Wait, listen, not safe." The phrase spread through the research community with a chill that turned elation to dread. Not safe. What was not safe? Earth. The message itself. The cosmos beyond. Theories exploded like wildfire. Some argued that the intelligence was warning of cosmic dangers, black holes, gamma-ray bursts, rogue asteroids. Others suggested it was a more intimate warning, that communication itself drew attention. that other eyes beyond were not as benevolent as these. A darker theory whispered through classified circles. Perhaps the intelligence was not warning humanity of danger, but manipulating them, seeding fear to control how they responded. The UN debated furiously. Should they reply? Should they ask what was unsafe, or cut off all transmissions before drawing greater risk? Nations clashed over control of observatories, demanding access to raw data. Tensions rose between countries that wanted to accelerate the exchange and those that demanded silence. Meanwhile, the pulses grew faster, urgent, as though the intelligence sensed humanity's indecision. Not safe, wait. Not ready. Danger comes. The last phrase left a scar across every mind that read it. Danger comes. Was it a prophecy or a threat? Was the intelligence warning them like a parent, or was it speaking as the danger itself? Alina found herself unable to rest. She replayed the sequences again and again, listening not only for words, but for tone, for rhythm, for intention hidden between pulses. Each beat felt alive, carrying something deeper than translation could capture. There was no malice in the signal, at least. None she could detect, but there was urgency, a gravity that made her stomach twist. And then the intelligence did something it had never done before. It posed a question. The sequence began haltingly, repeating fragments of human speech until coherence emerged. Do you want to see? The words were chilling in their simplicity. They struck like a riddle whispered by the abyss. The world froze, for the first time. The intelligence had asked humanity to choose. Some argued the invitation was salvaginti, chance to glimpse truths beyond imagination, to step into a galactic community waiting just beyond reach. Others saw only doom. What if seeing meant unveiling horrors too great to survive? What if the intelligence sought permission to reveal itself fully, and humanity was not ready for what would come? The divide widened. In cities across the globe, massive gatherings formed. Screens projected the question across skyscrapers. Do you want to see? Religious leaders thundered from pulpits, warning of forbidden fruit. Activists marched in celebration, chanting that humanity must open its eyes. Politicians scrambled to craft statements, careful not to commit their nations to either path. The UN called for global consensus. Weeks of debate followed, while the pulses waited patiently, repeating the question like a heartbeat. Do you want to see? Do you want to see? Each repetition gnawed at the human psyche, wearing down resistance, filling dreams with visions of alien skies and impossible shapes. Alina dreamed often in those weeks. In her sleep, she saw vast corridors of light, structures folding into themselves like origami made of stars. She saw shadows moving between worlds, carrying whispers of ancient knowledge. And always, at the end of her dreams, a voice asked the same question. Do you want to see? The weight of the choice grew unbearable. For the first time in human history, the species was faced not with survival or conquest, but with consent. They could say no, and perhaps the intelligence would withdraw, leaving them in solitude once more. Or they could say yes, and whatever came after would be irreversible. The day of decision arrived without warning. A group of rogue operators, frustrated by global indecision, took matters into their own hands. Using a powerful private transmitter hidden in the deserts of Nevada, they sent a reply. 3 simple words, encoded in pulses. Yes, we see. The world learned of the transmission hours later. It was too late to undo. Humanity had answered. The choice had been made, not by governments, not by consensus, but by a handful of rebels who believed the silence had gone on too long, and almost immediately, the pulses changed. They grew brighter, sharper, as though surging with energy. The rhythms accelerated, patterns folding into complexity too great for human minds to follow. For hours, observatories watched as the signal transformed, erupting into lattice of light that mapped across the solar system. Telescopes captured images of 3i Atlas, glowing with unnatural brilliance, its surface shimmering with patterns like veins of fire. Then, as suddenly as it began, the signal stilled. Silence fell across the instruments, a silence so complete it felt like a void. For the first time in months, there was nothing. No pulses, no words, no rhythms, just emptiness. The silence lasted 3 days. The world held its breath, waiting, dreading, praying. And then, without warning, the signal returned. But it was not the same. The first new phrase shook every translator, every listener, every soul. We are coming. The words reverberated through the silence of the world like the toll of a bell that could never be unheard. We are coming. Not a suggestion, not a question, but a promise. At first, many refused to believe the translation. Scholars argued over the meaning, claiming nuances may have been lost, that perhaps the phrase was symbolic rather than literal. But the pulses repeated it again and again, until doubt dissolved into inevitability. The intelligence, whatever and whoever it was, had declared intention. The reaction was unlike anything Earth had ever seen. Some celebrated with wild abandon, streaming into streets, waving banners that read welcome them. Others sank into despair, retreating into their homes, convinced that whatever came would erase them. Governments scrambled for plans, deploying satellites and mobilizing defense systems even while insisting to their citizens that nothing was certain. The skies filled with eyes, every telescope, every dish, every lens turned toward the lonely traveler moving silently on its path, toward the inner system. 3i Atlas had changed. Images revealed a glow now shimmering across its surface, patterns that shifted like liquid metal catching the sun. No longer did it resemble a simple interstellar rock. Its contours bent and flexed as though it were alive, as though the very fabric of its form was rewriting itself in preparation for something unimaginable. Yet, for all the spectacle, the visitor remained silent. The pulses stopped after the phrase, leaving humanity suspended in an unbearable quiet. 3 days passed, then 5, then 10. The world hovered between panic and awe, unsure if the silence was mercy or menace. It was Alina Vargas who first noticed the subtle echoes hidden beneath the quiet. She had not slept more than a handful of hours since the message. Her eyes burned as she scanned the data streams, her mind drifting in and out of focus. Then she saw it. Faint modulations buried in noise, so delicate they seemed more like whispers than transmissions. When amplified, they revealed not words but tones, resonances that shifted like a symphony played at the edge of hearing. She called them the arrival chords. The patterns grew each day, layered upon themselves in harmonics too precise to be natural. It was not communication as humans understood it, but preparation, a kind of prelude announcing a change in the order of things. News of the chords spread, igniting further speculation. Some said it was music, a greeting in a form older than language. Others insisted it was machinery, a vibration of vast engines preparing to breach the silence between stars. Conspiracy theorists whispered that the chords were not alien at all, but human experiments, cover for technologies long hidden in shadows. Yet beneath all theories lay the same undeniable truth. The chords were building, growing louder, stronger, impossible to ignore. As weeks passed, strange phenomena appeared across Earth. Radio waves warped unpredictably. Satellites experienced glitches. Compass needles twitched without cause. Storm systems moved with uncanny precision, as if nudged by unseen hands. Farmers reported that crops grew faster under skies touched by auroras that should not exist at such latitudes. And in the deep night, far from cities, some swore they could feel vibrations in their bones, a low hum that resonated not in ears but in the marrow itself. The world began to fracture in new ways. Entire nations declared the event sacred, calling for humanity to lay down arms and prepare for revelation. Others demanded defense, urging fleets and armies to ready themselves for battle. Economies trembled, stock markets swayed wildly, currencies lost value. Nothing on earth remained untouched by the three words and the silence that followed them. For Alina, it was different. She felt neither triumph nor terror, but something harder to name, a sense of inevitability, as though every choice humanity had made had led them here. Late at night, she stood on the roof of the observatory, staring at the dark line of sky where 3i Atlas moved unseen. The hum of the chords filled her thoughts. Sometimes, when the night was still, she thought she could almost make out voices woven into the resonance, whispers in a language too vast for comprehension. Then came the night when the chords broke into light. It began as a ripple through the skies of the southern hemisphere, a pale shimmer that stretched like a curtain across the stars. Within hours, the shimmer grew into bands of luminous color, cascading arcs that danced not like natural auroras but like deliberate brushstrokes painted across the heavens. Observers across Chile, South Africa, and Australia reported the same thing. The colors pulsed in exact synchronization with the arrival chords. Each shift in hue matched to a change in tone. For the first time, the pulses were not confined to instruments. They spilled into the world itself, visible to naked eyes, undeniable to even the staunchest skeptic. The sky had become a screen, and the message was no longer hidden in data streams, but etched into the very fabric of Earth's nights. The phrase returned, woven into both sound and light. "We are coming." This time it was not a translation. It was direct, unambiguous. People standing under the colored skies heard the words not in their ears, but in their minds, as though whispered from within. Millions dropped to their knees in awe. Millions more screamed in terror. No one remained untouched. The following days blurred into something dreamlike. Reports poured in from across the globe of strange experiences, shared dreams of towering structures rising from oceans of light. Visions of shadowed figures moving through corridors that stretched into infinity. Children spoke languages they had never learned, only to forget them upon waking. Entire cities experienced rolling blackouts as power grids faltered under the strain of interference. The boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary had thinned to near transparency, and still 3-1 ATLAS drew closer. Astronomers tracked its path as it curved into the inner solar system, its speed unaccountably shifting, as though propelled not by gravity but by will. It no longer behaved like an object bound by physics alone. Its glow deepened into something impossible, colors that had no name, hues that seemed to change each time they were looked at. Telescopes strained to capture it, and those who stared too long at the images sometimes claimed to see eyes staring back. Alina grew restless, her dreams more vivid each night. In them, she walked among landscapes carved from geometry and light, where beings neither human nor machine beckoned her forward. They spoke without words, their presence heavy with intent. Each dream ended the same way, with the voice asking the question again. Do you want to see? The world's final days before contact were filled with contradictions. Warships patrolled oceans while children painted stars on their bedroom walls. Economists warned of collapse while artists released symphonies inspired by the chords. People prayed, fought, embraced, despaired. Humanity was fractured yet unified by a single truth. Something was on its way, and it had already changed everything. The arrival came not with fire or thunder, but with silence. One morning, as dawn broke across the Pacific, every instrument pointed at the sky went still. The chords ceased. The pulses ended. Even the auroras faded into nothing. For a moment, the world thought it had been abandoned, left trembling in the wake of its own fear. Then, above the oceans, a shadow appeared. It was not a ship as humans understood ships. It was not even form as humans understood form. It was vast yet insubstantial, a ripple of darkness that bent the sunlight, casting patterns across waves like a second, impossible dawn. Its edges blurred into geometry that refused focus, shifting with every attempt to comprehend it. Those who saw it directly described different things. Some swore it looked like a cathedral suspended in air, its spires piercing clouds. Others said it resembled a swarm, countless entities moving as one. Some could not describe it at all, claiming their minds recoiled from its outline. And yet all agreed on one thing. It was alive. The shadow lingered, hovering at the edge of perception, never fully there, never fully gone. And then, for the last time, the voice came not in pulses, not in chords, but in a presence that filled the minds of every living soul. You are not alone. You are not ready. But you will be. The presence faded. The shadow dissolved. And just like that, the sky returned to ordinary blue, as though nothing had ever happened. 3I Atlas was gone. No telescope could find it. No radar could track it. Instruments that had captured its glow now registered only silence. In the span of moments, the visitor had vanished as inexplicably as it had arrived, but the world it left behind was no longer the same. Humanity had been seen. It had been spoken to, and though the stars grew quiet again, every person who had heard the words knew that silence was not emptiness. It was waiting. Alina stood alone in the observatory, staring at a sky that seemed suddenly too small. She whispered into the night, though no signal carried her words. We are ready, and for the first time she believed it.